Okay, the last time that Bill 25 was before the House, it was the member for Toronto-Danforth that had the floor. I return to the member for Toronto-Danforth.
Thank you, Speaker. As you can tell,
That's
Speaker,
before your speech.
the relief and appreciation from my colleagues is quite impressive. So this bill, emergency management, I guess I want to open with an overview, an introduction, that Ontario does in fact need a really strong, thought-through approach to emergencies. And what's unfortunate is that the bill before us won't give it. I want to speak to that, but to understand why this bill is not ready for the times, I think we have to talk for a moment, think for a moment about the times that we're going into. And this is a time of very massive change in our climate. We're looking at much hotter days becoming a far more common part of our daily lives, more wildfires in places that we hadn't thought of before, and flooding in places we hadn't expected before. So assessing that riskier new world and putting in place the mechanisms, the policies, the investments to take it on is going to be really critical to avoiding and then surviving new emergencies. And I don't see that approach in this bill, which is unfortunate because, in fact, it's absolutely necessary. It's a major failure to not have taken that on in preparation for this bill. We need an approach that will, in the years to come, as the world around us changes very sharply, protect our lives and property. So, with those introductory words, I want to expand on what's coming at us. When you actually check out the way other jurisdictions deal with disasters, some deal with them well, some deal with them badly. But the ones that do the best are the ones that try to prevent emergencies in the first place. It's a really old saying, a stitch in time saves nine. But in fact, having the preventative steps put in place so that you can avoid disruption of people's lives and destruction of property is really extraordinarily important. And so a bill that in fact doesn't seem to actually have in its DNA a proactive, thought-through response speaks to a fundamental weakness in the approach before us. I had an opportunity this morning, and I'm going to expand a bit more on it now, to talk about the world that we're going into. And, Speaker, not that many people follow the details of what's going on with climate change. They just know they're getting more wild weather, world's getting hotter. But you should know, 2015, a decade ago, there was a global meeting in Paris, in France, an adoption of a target for constraining global heating to limit it to 2 degrees with best efforts to get to 1.5. And those numbers were set because they are thresholds for substantial changes in the world around us. And the expectation or the projections for many years have been that we had a number of decades to go before we would hit those targets, the 1.5 and 2 degrees. And what's recently become very obvious in the last few years that in fact we don't have decades, that increasingly people who study climate and do projections have concluded that we will be hitting the 1.5, as it's called, guardrail, probably next year. Whereas many of us thought that we would have until the 2030s to deal with that. It is now, based on a number of those assessments, felt that we will hit the 2-degree mark sometime in the mid-2030s, whereas previously it was thought we would be talking about the 2040s or 2050s. And when you hit those marks, you start seeing qualitatively different climate impacts in our society. And we're already seeing very substantial changes with a temperature above what it was before the Industrial Revolution of about 1.2 degrees. So when you have those markers coming at you really fast, you know that substantial changes are going to happen. And I want to talk about some of those changes, some of the documentation. In 2023, a report came out prepared for the Government of Ontario, a report commissioned by this Conservative government, warning that climate change posed high risks to Ontario with impacts on everything from food production to infrastructure to business. The report, called the Provincial Climate Change Impact Assessment, projected a soaring number of days with extreme heat across Ontario, as well as increase in flooding and more frequent wildfires. That's not a bad summary. In 2024, the Globe and Mail published an editorial headline, "Facing the New Reality of Urban Wildfires." And I know for us in the South, we hear about wildfires that forced evacuation of communities. First Nations communities in northwestern Ontario have faced repeated evacuation. Northern Manitoba this past summer faced evacuations in a way not seen in a long time, if ever. But in southern Ontario, because of the different forest types and the different infrastructure, the general expectation was that we would not have that problem. But that is changing. And the Globe and Mail recognized in their editorial in 2024 that southern urban Canada is going to have to start thinking about wildfires. That is a reality. And they noted that in 2011 in Slave Lake in Alberta, there was a wildfire that came through and did massive destruction to the town. And the fire department in that town learned a lot, and they tried to get their lessons out to others. 5 years later, Fort McMurray was hit with a similar fire, and the folks from Slave Lake realized that no one had learned anything from what they had gone through. And if you get a chance, there's a book by a Canadian author, John Vaillant, called Fire Weather, which is a really gripping, very well-told story of what happened in Fort McMurray and the kind of disruption to people's lives that they went through and the ferocity of the fire that people were dealing with. 2023, we had forest fires that hit the outskirts of Halifax. We were lucky, but the reality was, and it was recognized afterwards, that fire crews were not prepared to tackle a blaze in the city's outskirts. Outside of Canada, in London, England, in August of 2022, the fire brigades had the busiest days they had seen since the Blitz, since World War II. And at one point, at a few points actually, every asset the Greater London Fire Service had was deployed. Every one. There was nothing in reserve. And they were lucky. As one person said, if we'd had a very high wind, one of the fires on the outskirts of London that took 35 houses could have become very big. 2024, luck ran out in Los Angeles, where a fire took out big chunks of the center of that city. So we actually need to start thinking about that issue. And I have to tell you, in preparation for this speech, in preparation for private member's bill I'm working on, I poked around to see who is actually doing preparatory work for urban wildfires. And I asked legislative research to look at the plans for Hamilton, for Ottawa, and Toronto. Fairly sophisticated cities, large population bases. I've dealt with the City of Toronto Civil Service. They're a pretty capable group, and my guess Ottawa and Hamilton is the same. No one actually had incorporated, as of this year, urban wildfires into their fire planning. Wasn't there. And when legislative research reached out to Ministry of Natural Resources, we couldn't get an answer back as to whether or not they had done planning for urban wildfires. I note, the Globe and Mail editorial was a little while ago, 2024. This discussion of urban wildfires is not brand new, and we are not prepared for it. And the bill before us today doesn't contemplate requiring an assessment of that threat landscape. New York City, different place, but New York City in the fall of 2024 had to deal with brush fires in their parks. And they had, what was it now? Fire Department of New York said it responded to more than 270 brush fires in the first 2 weeks of last November. Highest number ever in such a time. And obviously, not only were the fires a threat to the parks and the homes around the parks, but they generated a lot of smoke that caused health problems. The fire department chief was quoted saying, "We've been fighting brush fires for a long time, but the nature and extent of the fires last fall indicates a new level of threat. Whereas most fires in previous years were small and relatively easy to contain, some of the fires in 2024 grew quite large very quickly." So we need to be preparing for a very different regime. It doesn't mean all our cities are going to burn, but if you don't do the work in advance to reduce the threat, to have in place the infrastructure, to have in place the firefighters, then yeah, you do face a big threat. In doing some research here, I looked back at the Great Fire of Toronto in 1904, and it's instructive because right before that fire broke out, if I'm remembering correctly, City Council voted not to put money into more fire hydrants and more fire crews. And insurance companies, wisely trying to protect their future business, were quite insistent that if Torontonians wanted to get fire insurance, there needed to be an investment. We here in Ontario need to invest in our urban areas. We need to make sure that they are, to the extent possible, fireproof. This bill before us does not, as far as I can determine, actually put in place the framework necessary to ensure that we can deal with these threats. The other issue that comes up, and it touches both on human health but also on housing, is the whole question of flooding. And, you know, we've had flooding for a long time in urban areas. But in the city of New York, this was in 2021, they had flood events, rainfall coming down, not an overflow of a river, just the fall of rain onto the surface that led to 11 people drowning in their basement apartments. And in one instance, reported in The Guardian, a person talked about their experience in their apartment where they were asleep on their couch. Their cat woke them up. There was an inch or two of water on the floor. They scrambled out through their landlord's apartment above them, and within a few more minutes, the volume of water that broke down the door to the basement filled the basement to 5 feet. So the volume of water coming down is different. It's one that we need to actually incorporate into our planning, into our thinking. London, England is facing a similar problem. No reported drownings in basement apartments, but in 2025, it was calculated that more than 50,000 basement properties were increased risk of floods due to climate change. And many people, in fact, thousands, were driven out of basement apartments because of flooding. No one died, happily, but suddenly you had a city that was having to deal with a whole bunch of people whose homes were, at that point, no longer usable. So we're looking at fire in a way that we haven't had to deal with it before. We're looking at flooding in a way we haven't had to deal with before. And because of that flooding and the risk to people in basement apartments, you're looking at a contraction in the housing supply, or a risk of contraction in the housing supply. We all know we already have a housing crisis. The idea that we would lose even more units is really hard to stomach.
What can go wrong when you build on a floodplain?
I have to say that what comes with those physical impacts are social impacts. And it is generally projected that as we hit that 2-degree increase, we're going to see a drop in the standard of living. It is just very hard to keep supply chains going, to keep trains running, to keep roads operative when things are being washed out on a regular basis, or when fire destroys infrastructure. So we're looking at physical impact on people, and we're looking at the impact on society which causes substantial social problems.